Imagine waking to the sound of a church bell tolling, not for morning prayer, but for another neighbor who did not survive the night. In this documentary, you will step into the life of an ordinary peasant during the year when a silent, unstoppable force swept across Europe. You will experience the world of 1347 as it felt to those who lived through the first winter of the plague, uncertain, fearful, and profoundly fragile. By the middle of the 14th century, most peasants lived under the authority of feudal lords, bound to the land, dependent on harvests, and vulnerable to famine and disease. When reports reached villages of a mysterious sickness spreading along trade routes from distant lands, few understood its nature. They only knew that something was coming and that nothing in their world would ever be the same. Before the arrival of the disease, the life of a peasant was predictable, though harsh. You woke before dawn, tended to fields belonging to your lord, and prayed the weather would not betray you. Hunger was a familiar companion, and medical knowledge was little more than folk wisdom. The arrival of any illness, even a simple fever, could devastate entire households. But in the late months of that fateful year, rumors began to travel faster than merchants. People whispered about lands to the east where whole families collapsed within hours, their bodies marked by dark swellings. Villagers did not know it yet, but this was the early shadow of the great mortality. A few monastic chronicles beginning in the year 1347 describe caravans of traders, some feverish, some coughing, moving westward. Most peasants never read these writings, but they felt the shift in the air. Livestock grew restless, travelers seemed fewer, and the clergy prayed more urgently. You would first notice fear before the plague itself. A merchant passing through your village might speak of entire towns shuttered, with carts of bodies pulled to communal pits. Others might insist the sickness was a punishment for human sin, a sign of divine wrath. The tension spread faster than the illness. At night, families sat close together, whispering about omens. A red sunrise might be interpreted as a warning. The sudden death of a cow might be seen as a sign of approaching doom. In the absence of science, interpretations grew darker, and every unexplained event fed the growing panic. Some villages would bar entry to outsiders, posting watchmen along roads, but no barrier could hold back what was coming. The plague reached quietly, often through a single traveler or a ship unloading goods at a distant port. One chronicler wrote of a small settlement where a visiting peddler collapsed in the center of the market square. By evening, he burned with fever. By dawn, he passed away. You, as a peasant, might notice neighbors coughing behind shuttered windows. Then, perhaps, a distant relative falls ill. Fever, swollen glands beneath the arms, vomiting, and delirium. There were no remedies, no cures, only folk rituals. Herbs hung above doorways, charms buried near thresholds, prayers whispered without pause. Within a few days, more villagers would fall ill. Some sought help from the church, believing holy water could repel the sickness. Others hid in their homes, terrified that the very air carried death. For peasants, the church was the central source of both guidance and hope. Priests organized processions, urging people to repent. Bells rang throughout the night, echoing across wind-swept fields. Candles burned in every chapel, flickering with the prayers of hundreds. But as the illness spread, even the clergy faltered. Monks who cared for the sick often perished themselves. Parish priests disappeared from their posts, fleeing to safer regions. Some villagers interpreted this abandonment as proof that the world was entering its final days. Still, others clung to faith, gathering before the altar to beg for mercy. Hymns filled the sanctuaries, but so did fear. The churchyards began to overflow with fresh graves. By now, the rhythm of your village life had changed completely. Fields went untended because there were too few hands left to work them. Livestock wandered freely, searching for their absent caretakers. Market days, once lively and noisy, became silent. Every morning, the air carried a mixture of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint scent of decay. A cart rolled through the village square, collecting bodies wrapped in simple cloth, taken to hastily dug pits at the edge of the settlement. No funerals, no final blessings, only quiet resignation. Families feared to touch one another. Mothers kept distance from sick children, terrified yet helpless. Every cough in the night felt like the beginning of the end. Peasants sought answers anywhere they could. Some blamed the stars, believing celestial misalignment had poisoned the air. Others accused minority groups or travelers, convinced the sickness was caused by malice rather than nature. Rumors spread about poisoned wells, cursed winds, and witchcraft. Desperate minds reached for desperate explanations. In some regions, frightened villages turned violent, attacking outsiders in a misguided attempt to stop the plague. Yet none of these actions changed the course of events. The sickness continued its relentless path, moving from home to home with terrifying speed. As the plague deepened its grip, the bonds that once held your community together began to unravel. Neighbors who once shared food and tools now avoided each other. Doors stayed barred. Windows were shuttered. Even simple acts of kindness, offering bread, helping with chores, became rare, for fear that proximity meant death. Village gatherings ceased entirely. No feasts, no marriages, no seasonal festivals. Even religious holidays passed without ceremony. The rhythms that gave meaning to the year dissolved into a continuous, breathless vigilance. When the social structure weakened, authority itself began to dissolve. Some local officials fled. Others enforced harsh restrictions. But fear ruled above all else. Inside your home, life became a tense, anxious vigil. The air felt heavy. Every sound from the outside carts, coughing, distant wailing pierced the silence. Families rationed food, unsure when trade would resume or whether the village miller was still alive to grind grain. A typical peasant household in these months was marked by dim candlelight, whispered conversations, and the constant dread of discovering symptoms on your own body. Mothers checked children for fevers. Fathers inspected their skin for swellings. Elders murmured prayers before sleep. Sometimes you would hear scratching at the door animals seeking shelter, or desperate travelers begging for a place to rest. Most were turned away. Compassion had grown dangerous. Medical knowledge was scarce, and much of what existed was rooted in superstition. If a member of your household fell ill, you might try herbal poultices of rosemary or thyme, believing they could purify the body. Charcoal mixtures were burned indoors to cleanse the air. Windows were sealed with wax-soaked cloth to keep out the supposedly poisoned winds. Some villages hired self-taught healers who attempted bloodletting or placed hot irons on swollen buboes. These methods rarely helped and often worsened the suffering. In wealthier towns, early forms of protective attire were seen: long robes, gloves, and masks filled with fragrant herbs. But peasants rarely had access to such measures. Most relied on prayer, folk magic, or resignation. The plague was not only a physical crisis, it was a mental one. Fear reshaped every hour of the day. Even healthy villagers felt the weight of dread settle on their shoulders. You might find yourself waking repeatedly at night, checking the breathing of your family members. Some peasants reported vivid dreams of dark figures approaching their beds. Others heard phantom bells or thought they saw ghostly lights in the fields. Chroniclers from this era describe entire villages falling into despair, convinced that the world was coming to an end. With so many graves and so few survivors to dig them, the boundary between the living and the dead felt thinner than ever. Hunger soon became as great a threat as the plague itself. With farmers dying or too afraid to work the fields, crops rotted, grain stores dwindled, and livestock went untended. Markets were abandoned. Trade routes collapsed as merchants avoided plague-stricken regions. If you were a peasant, you might spend your days searching for edible herbs, trapping small animals, or rationing the last of the winter grain. Some villages resorted to consuming seed grain, ensuring starvation in the following year. Chroniclers speak of entire herds wandering free, unclaimed and untended, because their owners had perished. The world felt unmoored, stripped of the order that once governed daily life. Even as your village suffered, you would hear of worse horrors beyond its borders. Travelers whispered of entire towns emptied, with only the wind moving through silent streets. In some regions, local authorities stopped counting the dead entirely, unable to keep pace. From trading ports to rural hamlets, the sickness traveled along every road, carried by merchants' carts and the fleas hidden in their cargo. As month followed month, it became clear that no region, no matter how remote, was beyond the reach of the plague. For peasants who lived their whole lives within a few miles of home, the idea that the entire world was succumbing to the same fate was almost impossible to comprehend. Yet, even in the darkest times, there were flashes of compassion. Some villagers risked their lives to care for neighbors, bringing food or tending fires for the sick. Clergy members performed last rites even as they too began to cough and weaken. Parents stayed beside feverish children despite the danger. Siblings held one another through the night, refusing to abandon family. These moments, though small, revealed a quiet resilience within the suffering. Some later chroniclers wrote that the courage of ordinary peasants, those who buried the dead, who shared dwindling food, who comforted the dying, was as remarkable as the plague was terrifying. When the worst had passed, many villages were unrecognizable. Fields lay overgrown. Entire families had vanished. The silence after the plague was almost unbearable. Survivors stepped out of their homes like ghosts, wandering through places that felt both familiar and foreign. For the peasants who lived, a new world awaited one shaped by loss, but also by unexpected opportunity. With so few laborers left, lords were forced to treat survivors with greater respect. Wages rose, restrictions loosened. The old order cracked, but the scars remained. The memory of 1347 lingered in every rebuilt home, every freshly tilled field, every whispered prayer at dusk. The experience of a peasant in the year of the plague reveals a truth that stretches across centuries. Humanity lives always on the edge of forces it cannot fully control. The men and women of 1347 faced terror beyond measure, yet they endured through faith, instinct, and fragile hope. Their world was reshaped not by kings or armies, but by the quiet perseverance of those who survived, and in their resilience we glimpse the shared thread that binds all of human history, a determination to continue, even when the darkness seems absolute.